Hey everyone, this video came up in my recommendeds and it was a response to Blair White's recent video responding to the response to ContraPoints. So I decided to make a response video.
I saw the Blair White video defending ContraPoints, and it's fine, whatever. I was like, I didn't know exactly who Blair White was. I'd only heard references of her from like the atheist community and like some other weird YouTube subgroups. I actually had to Wikipedia and Google her to find out that she's a transgendered Trump supporter who is 6 years younger than me. So she doesn't actually know what it was like before.
She never finishes this sentence because I don't think she really knows what the difference 6 years ago is. Later she's going to talk about gay marriage being legal, but it really doesn't sound like this had that much of an impact on her life. And I just think it's very strange to completely invalidate someone's experience because they're, 6 years younger? That the idea that, like, we were in this, like, anti-gay, anti-trans, like, dystopia a mere 6 years earlier seems pretty ridiculous. This is basically like the 50 years ago fallacy, right? Where, once you say it's 50 years ago, you just start making stuff up because nobody or very few people are going to even remember, right? So you just say, oh, well, if it's not like 50 years ago and everything was like this. And then, of course, 50 years ago, they were saying the same thing. Well, it's not like 50 years ago. So this is just 50 years ago fallacy, but like on steroids. Now it's 6 years ago fallacy, apparently.
I'm also in a parkade, so my building manager might knock on the window, so that'd be weird, but whatever. I know that she's pleasant to talk to, and she's very good at arguing and debating, but from her video, it seems like she doesn't really, like, put emphasis on, like, research, because, her main deal was non-binary should not be part of the trans moniker, I guess. There's gonna be a car going by. Because they don't go through hormone therapy, she can't relate to it.
So she just said that she's not very familiar with Blair White earlier, but now she's characterizing Blair White's overall approach based on one video. Maybe she's just misspoken. Maybe she just means to say that in this particular video, there wasn't a heavy research emphasis, which I'm not really sure why there need to be. Blair White did give a lot of specific clips to illustrate exactly what it is she's criticizing.
I identify as a designated female at birth, shape-shifting girl, probably.
And as for the argument that a person shouldn't be considered trans because they don't transition, I don't know, it seems kind of ridiculous. Like, of course, going through the hormone therapy and surgery and actually changing your body to deal with an actual dysphoria, that's obviously a lot more serious, and I think it makes a lot of sense that that's going to be a very, very different experience than from basically just playing dress up.
Then she used a ridiculous 7-Eleven example where she walks into a 7-Eleven and demands that they respect her pronouns, but we all know that that only actually happens in safe spaces.
Like, I don't walk up to the cash register at 7-Eleven with my Slurpee and my hot dog and say, hi, how much is it? And by the way, before you even talk to me, my pronouns are she and hers. That's stupid.
It is stupid, but apparently all three of us are in agreement that that would be stupid. This is only for safe spaces, is what we're expected to believe. But, is all of Twitter a safe space? It seems like, the use of pronouns is something that people want, everywhere, publicly, and I don't find this convincing at all that all you're asking for is the safe space. I think that once a foot's in the door, you're going to take as much as you can and argue for this in as many circumstances as possible. We've already seen that people who run private businesses don't have basic rights to their own property in terms of setting their own rules and in terms of the right to refuse service as well. So the precedent has been set that yes, in fact, we could see people march into the 7-Eleven and demand their pronouns be acknowledged.
So, what are you talking about? Do you actually like march into places? Have you ever seen someone march into a place and go, "I'm a," not in a sarcastic way, like, "I'm a woman, call me a woman"? No one has ever done that.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
We know where we stand as non-binary people.
If that were true, then I don't think there would be such a push to demand that validation come from other people.
Oh, ridiculous example of the 7-Eleven. Alright, so she was saying that we're destroying the binary and they're just working through the binary. They're like being all homogenous and working with everything. She said that pansexual and bisexual are basically the same thing. Why do we have like different acronyms for them? Pansexual people do date trans people. Bisexual people do not. And I can tell you from being a bisexual person, I don't date trans people. I've gotten a lot of shit for that, and a lot of other bisexuals have gotten a lot of shit for that. Some do, but you'd probably fall into the pan category if you do.
You know what's funny is for all of the discussion of bisexuality versus pansexuality, this is the first I've heard someone just very candidly state the difference in a way that's very clear and actually makes these terms useful. So I'll give credit where credit's due, you know. Now, I would imagine that a lot of people within both camps are gonna have an issue with this idea that that you would categorize them based on their behavior. I don't personally, but I think that's very interesting.
She also said there's a long history of being trans, and that's simply not true because if you can't have surgery and hormone therapy before a certain point, like throughout history, trans people were basically like cross-dressers and non-binary. Like,
I imagine the argument would be that the dysphoria is part of what makes the difference, and also wanting to be the other gender, not something in between or something totally different. Now, if you were to take Blair White and put her into a circumstance where she doesn't have the access or ability to transition in the modern sense, is she then the same as the non-binary people? I imagine that she probably suffers more compared to these people who are basically just kind of making a joke of the whole thing. And I think that's the key difference here that you're kind of avoiding.
They're pretty much the same thing. There's this long tradition of two-spirited people. They were their own separate gender and class. In some indigenous groups, I could tell you that there's a northern one. I wrote a very boring essay on it, where they would force a boy to dress as a woman until he killed a polar bear. So,
wow, if you were able to make that boring, you've got some talent.
There's lots of gender dynamics throughout the ages, but being a transgendered person was not really fully understood or accepted back then. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying that things were a little different before Blair White was born.
You shifted the goalpost to make this be about acceptance in order to make a completely different point. Obviously, things were different before Blair White. I don't think anyone's contesting that.
All right. Let's go back 10, 15 years when the LGBT community was considering just kicking out the trans people and getting rid of the T.
Well, since you're 6 years older than Blair and qualified to comment on things that happened 15 years ago, does that mean that Blair actually is qualified to talk about things that happened up to 9 years ago? Or do we need to get somebody who is 9 years older than you to actually get a proper opinion on this? But in all seriousness, we have come a long way, from the Rainbow Coalition spectrum trying to get rid of the T's to the gay men begging to be left alone and to disassociate from it.
This was because lesbian, gay, and bisexual are sexual preferences. Transgender is it's a gender-related thing. Like, how do you quantify that? I don't know.
It's pretty amusing that you've done such a good job in defining bisexuality versus pansexuality, but then such a bad job defining transgenderism. But no, I agree with the actual point here. It doesn't make any sense to include the T because, with gay, lesbian, and bisexual, it's clearly all referring to one aspect of sexual identity. Once you added trans, now it's a coalition of all sexual minorities, and that's why you have to include the pedophiles and the necrophiliacs.
And at the time, it was not illegal to dress as a member of the opposite sex. It was frowned upon highly, and you could get your ass kicked for it, but it wasn't illegal, while being gay, lesbian, or bisexual was illegal, and you could be punished for it. In fact, in Canada, 2004 was when we heard that they were going to decriminalize. Okay, they decriminalized it in the 60s, and then they let us get married in 2004. So I was in my first year of university when I was allowed to get married to a same-sex partner. And that was a big deal. A lot of people broke up because they didn't want to get married.
My theory is that this was the actual problem and not being able to be married beforehand. But obviously I don't have much evidence. That's just a theory. Now, it's very strange that you mentioned it being decriminalized decades ago and then segue this right into not being allowed to be married in the same way. I just think that's a completely ludicrous comparison to make, and it really does seem like you've taken the one thing, the one legal inequality, and said, well, we didn't have absolutely everything, therefore it's just like it not having even been decriminalized. And of course, I have to note that this blurring of a distinction between the gay male experience and the lesbian experience is something that really should end. For all of the sensitivity, right, that we're doing this whole video, this whole big response to Blair White, that I'm responding to you now over this relation between bisexuals and pansexuals and trans people, and that this is happening in the same context where we completely ignore the fact that the gay male experience was much more brutal, that there was much more punitive action put towards that specifically, whereas lesbians were kind of mostly just left alone and mostly historically irrelevant. I think is a stunning hypocrisy and something that I think people need to take a step back and really think about.
So what they're doing, what the trans community, the passing trans community on YouTube, what they're echoing is the old sentiment that trans people should not be part of the LGBT community because they're too different and they don't have the same driving force behind them, because we were fighting criminalization, harassment from the police. I remember being 16 and in a dance hall at a gay dance, and the police busted in, walked around, intimidated everybody, but left, because at that point it was decriminalized, but it still wasn't quite legal where I am.
I have no idea what that means or what to make of this story because she doesn't really clarify any of that.
We had our first Pride Parade in, I think it was 2012, after fighting with Mayor Walter Gray for years and years. All right. So understand that being transgendered and passing is great. Have fun with that, but don't say that non-binary people don't deserve to be in that category with you on a visceral disgust kind of level. This is where it's coming from, is the disgust with non-binary people and how it scares trans people into thinking that they won't be accepted by society, because let's face it, you're not going to be if anyone finds out. And if you hide that sort of thing, bad things can happen.
Doesn't the fact that we're already able to refer to these groups of people distinctly kind of demonstrate that it's not very useful to have them in the same category? And I find this to be very bizarre. Why is there an insistence that you're put in the same category? What's wrong with being in a different category? And I also am not buying this disgust argument. I mean, first of all, you know, who are you to dictate what a person should or shouldn't feel? People can be disgusted by whatever they want to be disgusted by, and I don't think there's any real imperative that says that that's necessarily right or wrong. You're not entitled to being accepted by others. You're just not. You're entitled to being maybe tolerated, but no, not accepted. People don't have to accept you, and I think that's the big takeaway here, is you're trying to bully people into accepting you and forcing you into a label when it is a totally different experience. I also just want to note, I'm not really buying that this disgust is anything that really matters when, you know, in Blair's video, she's literally included an example where she's sitting around with a whole bunch of non-binary people and having a discussion with them. So if it's a level of disgust, obviously it's not enough of a disgust that she would like avoid like a basic association or being in the same room with them. So I'm not really sure what the big deal is.
So it's better to strive for acceptance overall than it is to try to compartmentalize everyone into little boxes.
Or you could gain that acceptance through understanding, and you could gain that understanding by making distinctions and using separate terms and separate categories for different things.
Alright, so the ContraPoints thing was what she initially was talking about. ContraPoints, if she is a celebrity YouTuber, then we don't have the right to criticize her, but if she's an advocate, we do have the right to criticize her, and she's been to university, she knows this. And she's just going off of feels, I'm thinking.
Yes, I'm sure that all of the people who engage with ContraPoints were, you know, just offering criticism, and that nothing about it was characteristic of like an angry mob-like backlash. Now to be fair, I don't really think that that's necessarily something to take off the table, but it seems like here Blair is just kind of weighing in and saying, you know, who she thinks is reasonable. I don't think she's saying that you're not allowed to criticize big YouTubers. I think that's another straw man.
All right. I think that's all my notes. Definitely all my time. I have 30 seconds left. Don't subscribe to me. Leave me alone. Eat shit. Goodbye.